Hello, everybody, and welcome to this foundational document overview video. Today, we are tackling Federalist 10. That is all about the fear of factions. Federalist 10 is a direct response by the Federalists to this argument in Brutus I. The argument in Brutus I was that a large republic cannot survive. It always throughout history has given itself over to tyranny. But James Madison, writing in Federalist 10, is going to respond to that argument to defend the Constitution. Right off the bat, let's remember the purpose of all of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were written specifically to the people of the state of New York, but more broadly, it was to the country to defend this new Constitution that had been created at the Constitutional Convention. Now, James Madison was one of the foremost figures behind the design of this Constitution, and in this he addresses the fear that every republic, that every democracy needs to address, and that is the fear of factions. You see, this was a historical problem dating back for millennia of what do democracies do about factions. Let me explain a little bit more. Let's dive right in. A faction is just a way of saying a group of people with a common interest. The people don't all have to look alike or be alike, but they do have a common interest. And the fear in democracy is that if common interest unites people, what if that common interest is a negative thing? For instance, what if one group of people, their common interest is to take away the rights of another group of people? You see, faction is a word with a highly negative connotation. It connotes the idea of tyranny, and it really connotes the idea of taking over other smaller groups of people, taking over their rights. The idea is that really a faction can end up close to an angry mob. And this was the fear with democracy. What happens if it devolves into mob rule? Now, the worry for the Constitution was that it was taking the American Republic, right, which existed in these 13 distinct states, and saying, now we're going to have one grand republic with the potential to expand across the continent. And the concern was, what is its protection against factions? Now, Brutus had a slightly different concern, which is, what are we going to do about the fact that the leaders are going to be far from their people? But James Madison says that's not really the right question. The real problem we need to worry about is factions. And James Madison makes a very logical argument in Federalist 10. He breaks it down point by point. He says, look, we don't want factions to take over our government. So the issue of factions, it's just like any problem. There are two solutions. You can eliminate the causes of factions, or you can control the effects. This is sort of the branching argument Madison proposes. He says, well, let's start with that first one, eliminating the causes. What would that really mean? What are the causes of factions? Well, he says one of the principal causes of factions is liberty. The fact that people have the freedom to speak their mind. This is going to lead to people disagreeing and having different opinions. As long as people are allowed to speak their mind freely, well, they're going to have different opinions. And on the other hand, one of the core reasons why people have different interests is because they have different needs. Someone who is in the wealthiest upper class of the citizenry is going to have different desires from their government than people in the lower classes, right? People in the lower classes are going to want much more support from their government. People in the higher classes are going to want much more, hey, government, keep your hands out of my wallet. And James Madison points out both of these things are natural, right? It is natural for people to have freedom and the ability to speak their mind. It is natural for people to make and lose wealth. And so he says, if our solution to factions is to take away liberty and to take away wealth disparity, well, then our solution is worse than the problem. We would be living in a dictatorship, and yeah, we wouldn't have the problem of factions anymore. He says that is out. We need to focus not on eliminating the causes, but on controlling the effects. And so how do we actually go about controlling the effects of factions? Well, James Madison says there are two cases where factions actually must be controlled. And he says these are going to cover everything. When a faction is in the minority, what do we do? And when a faction is in the majority, what do we do? Now, the first one is pretty obvious. When a faction is in the minority, I mean, if the faction is in the minority, they aren't going to be able to elect people to Congress. They aren't going to be able to elect the president. They aren't going to be able to get a Supreme Court justice appointed by the president who's elected by those states and by the Congress that approves them. So if a faction is in the minority, they might be a nuisance, but the idea that they're going to take over a large part of the government, James Madison says that is defeated by the Republican principle, which is that in most cases in a republic, the majority rules. This is the idea of a constitution. Not in all cases, but in most cases in a republic, the majority rules. So a minority, they can't trample on the rights of the majority per se. That's just not a feasible word. However, what about if a faction takes hold of the majority? What about if there is a dangerous ideology that wants to oppress another group of the citizenry and they control 51% of the population? What happens then? Well, James Madison asks a simple question. He says, this is where you guys have all underestimated a large republic, because think about it. Where will a faction have more impact? Let's say a faction takes control of the majority of the state. What if we give sovereignty to the states? Let's say the state is Texas. Obviously, Texas did not exist in the same way it does today back then. But if we have sovereign states who are on their own and essentially independent, locked only by this firm league of friendship, is a faction going to have more effect then? Or is a faction going to have more effect if the country as a whole is united in its systems of governance? And James Madison believes this is obvious. Look at the picture. If a faction controls a sovereign state, well, then that faction is immensely dangerous to the people of that state. But if a faction takes hold in a state that is one of many states that stand on equal footing in our national government, with Congress, a strong legislature, with executive, a strong president, and with the judicial branch, well, that faction, it doesn't have a chance to spread, right? The disease is contained to that state, and that disease will be defeated in the national legislature. See, a faction is more dangerous, James Madison says, in a small republic than in a large republic. James Madison says, as you extend the sphere, as you make the country bigger, you decrease the chance that a dangerous faction will control the majority. Think about it. They just have more work to do. This doesn't even have to apply specifically to negative factions. You know, imagine if I really wanted to propose a law, and in my law, I really wanted to make it so that there was a new holiday. And on this new holiday, we celebrated Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. You know, my Reese's Peanut Butter Cup party. Imagine if the state is sovereign, right? I'm going to have much more luck trying to convince people in my state to make that a holiday as opposed to the country. It's just harder for ideas to spread across a large area. And this is why it's also harder for dangerous ideas to spread across a large area. And thus, a large republic actually controls factions. James Madison puts it this way. If there is a factious leader, that is a leader of the faction, someone with dangerous ideas, well, the influence of a factious leader may kindle a flame within their particular states, but it will be unable to spread through the other states. The country is just too big. Think about how primitive communication was in these days. In some ways, we don't have the same blessing of how slowly ideas spread. However, it is still true that it is much harder to spread an idea, including a dangerous idea, including a factious idea throughout an entire country than through just one state. And this is why the federal government is a great tool for controlling factions if the republic exists at a large enough scale. Thanks for tuning in today. Hope this video was helpful for you. Best of luck. Have a good one.